They gave O'Shea the illegal unofficial job of running Dachau prison after he escaped it in December 1943. As if the governor. But they did not give him the fatally wounded but alive governor's identity. Not like the other escaped inmates who started pretending to be staff. They made O'Shea over to look like Hermann Göring instead, in Hermann's clothes, with his identity documents. That was despite the fact that Hermann Göring never worked for the law enforcement and government departments associated with running prisons in Germany at all. It was a random thing, completely out of context of the rest of their actions. The actual governor was fatally wounded in the raid on the jail by the Neo-Nazis. He was then dumped in the jail, with nobody bothering to steal his identity at all. He died in the jail as one of the early illegally detained victims. Was homosexual. There were photographs taken of him after he died, laying on the ground with his hands between his legs, before the prison was filled with abduction victims. Hermann Göring had nothing to do with running jails. He was abducted from the coffee shop in Berlin in December 1943. Disfigured in the face beyond recognition. Then dumped in the jail in his thermal underwear for being homosexual. He survived until the end of World War II. Was interviewed. Not called as a witness at the Nuremberg trials. And died in the mid-1960s. His estate was illegally withheld from the beneficiaries when he died. The person tried at Nuremberg, including for illegally using Hermann Göring's identity for around 18 months, was tried for pretending to be the prison governor from the governor's on-site office and nearby off-site residence. But O'Shea was not using the deceased governor's identity. Using Hermann Göring's instead, who was completely irrelevant to running jails his whole life. Like obvious sports corruption, zoomed in, slow motion, on IMAX. Insane is the word. When the Neo-Nazis took the building, Kaiser and Chancellor Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern did emergency radio frequency broadcasts from, in case the emergency frequencies were all that was left. They got a voice impersonator in. A New Zealand-born female called Isabel Williams, nicknamed Fritz. She used to get around dressed like a man. They made the audio quality as deteriorated as they could. People who heard her fake broadcasts could barely hear the details, even when the transistor radios were held up against the ear. Williams asked German citizens and residents to go to the usual places requested in similar broadcasts done by the real Kaiser Adolf. If people responded and went to venues like schools, hospitals, factories, and air raid shelters as requested, they were mass murdered. Photographs of them were taken lying dead in the venues. In a lot of cases the poisons or toxins used were supplied by South Americans from places like Argentina. They developed a reputation nobody else knew about because of it, expecting fear from anyone part German afterwards, by assumption. Williams was made over by that award-winning film production crew to look like Kaiser and Chancellor Adolf Hitler the Hohenzollern after participating in the beginnings of the mass genocide of German citizens and residents. She wasn't appropriate to be made over, under the rules and specifications they were using. But she lured millions to their deaths over the barely audible radio broadcasts with her voice impersonation, so they made her over anyway. Gave her a Kaiser Hitler costume to wear every day, etc. Attempts to portray her as the real Kaiser Adolf dead in that bunker in Berlin in 1945 are that pathetic. She had a vagina and breasts, you know. Williams was heavily menstruating when shot dead. She was shot for pretending to sexually penetrate a fatal bullet wound to Janet Podolsky's forehead whilst gyrating at the hips and screaming in an Adolf Hitler costume in front of onlookers when she was shot dead. She had just shot Podolsky at random minutes earlier than her sister and cousin. The neo-Nazi caused mass genocide. Deceased citizens and residents of Germany were stripped of all clothing and identification, which was stockpiled. Down to naked. Their bodies were then processed through fertilizer production factories used to process things like animal carcasses. Those fertilizer plants left only bones afterwards. The bones of the victims were then mill ground down to a fine powder. It was added to enormous mass stockpiles of concrete mix in storage in Germany. There were no bodies left afterwards, regardless of how many million were mass murdered by the neo-Nazis. People still say no bodies. What mass genocide of German citizens and residents? They use the victims' family identities when saying it, in a lot of cases. People who wandered into the deserted centers of the major cities in Germany were told if they could find clothing of victims that fit them, they could use the clothes. If the clothing had identity documents and valuables with the clothes, they could use the identities and keep the valuables. They were told that if the clothing had photo identification in it, to pick someone with similar looks, where possible. Then clothes that fit, ideally. There were millions of victims' clothing to choose from. People sorted through them looking for something in huge piles in warehouses and aircraft hangars. In massive skip bins full of clothing and personal items. Tens of thousands of family identities were stolen that way. Including organized crime trash stealing entire large family identities for a group of thieves. The identity thieves then scoped out the residences of the mass genocide victims. Scoured the houses, flats, apartments, and units clean of anything even remotely valuable. Adding to their personal collection of identity items as they went. It was decided that living in the housing, pretending to be the deceased victims wasn't as easy or sensible as it could have sounded. They mass murdered millions, but there were still tens of millions of Germans who were not dead. Including the homosexuals illegally held prisoner in jails by escaped inmates. They would likely recognize the difference quite readily. So, they demolished the residences of the victims during 1944 and 1945, coordinated by the neo-Nazis. It is safe to assume they tried to demolish the accommodation of nearly every person murdered in that mass genocide of citizens and residents of Germany by the neo-Nazis starting December 1943. They had all the clothing with all the identification people were required to carry due to circumstance in huge stockpiles. And almost no bodies at all, if any. Lunatics were recruited to destroy the residences of the victims after they were picked clean of valuables and other useful items. People were paid to go to the properties, drill holes, plant TNT, dynamite, and incendiary devices. Light the fuses, then run away quickly and wait for them to detonate. Then pile up the rubble to make it appear to be air raid bombings. Top floor down, one floor at a time. They were also told to dye the rubble particular colors. Do anything to make it appear to be air raid bombings. The lunatics were fueled by alcohol and early amphetamines like crystal meth. Any illicit drug they pretended Kaiser Adolf was on in fake history records is a safe assumption. People became so obsessed with it, giggling like lunatics in huge demolishing squads, that they took huge risks. It was estimated that over 40,000 people died due to not running away in time after planting the explosives and incendiary devices and were killed by their own planted explosives. It was the final explanation for tens of thousands of dead perpetrators' body parts, like arms and legs, being found in the rubble in Berlin alone after World War II. Afterwards, there were very few of the mass genocide victims' residences left. After World War II ended, the identity thieves in the victims' stolen clothing with identity documents and portable keepsakes did their best impersonation of German citizens and residents they could muster. With hair dye and deceased victims' clothing. They pretended the damage was air raids with bombings, fake German accents, and pretended to plead cry homeless due to bombings. Asking for help from Allied forces and others after mid-1945. Oh. No. My apartment. Please help. In the best fake German accent they could put on. Now have another look at film of Berlin in June or July 1945 on the internet. Keep in mind the majority of the damage was mass genocide victims and missing persons' places of residence demolished from within Germany by lunatics who went to the addresses found on identity documents in the deceased victims' clothing. With very few intact bodies accounted for. Body parts found in the rubble of deceased persons were people blowing up the buildings that didn't run away in time after fuses were lit by hand. People still routinely wear the clothing of German citizens and residents killed in that neo-Nazi mass genocide in the major cities of Germany from December 1943 through to mid-1945. They still have huge stockpiles. They claim it is tradition to wear the victims' clothes from the mid-20th century when stalking people. Particularly anyone who is part German, obviously. Me in particular. No matter how offensively out of place they look whilst wearing them.